The sound of a gunshot echoed through the dusty street of Redemption Springs as Patience Miller clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Only 2 weeks a widow, and already the vultures were circling, men who thought a young woman alone with a baby would be easy pickings in this harsh frontier town. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was no place for a woman without protection. "I believe the lady made herself clear," came a deep voice from behind her. "She ain't interested in your offer of assistance, Silas." Patience turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun, his stance casual but the Colt revolver in his hand anything but. Thomas Blackwood, the notorious gunslinger who drifted into town 3 days prior, stood with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself. His shot had deliberately gone wide, a warning rather than a kill, but the message was clear. Silas Jenkins, the local saloon owner who'd been pressuring Patience to work for him since her husband's death, backed away with his hands raised. "No harm meant, Blackwood, just trying to help a widow in need." "Seems to me she needs your kind of help like she needs a rattlesnake in her boot," Thomas replied, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable edge of menace. "Now ride on." Jenkins scurried away, leaving Patience alone with the gunslinger on the boardwalk outside the general store. The baby in her arms began to fuss, tiny fists waving in the air. "Thank you," Patience said, bouncing her daughter gently. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "No need for thanks, madam," Thomas cut her off, holstering his weapon. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-weathered skin, glanced down at the infant. "Your little one all right," Patience nodded. "Emma's fine, just hungry, I expect." An awkward silence fell between them. Thomas Blackwood wasn't known for his conversation, having spent most of his time in Redemption Springs drinking alone at the far end of the bar. The rumors about him varied. Some said he was a bounty hunter, others a hired gun. All Patience knew was that he kept to himself, and that men like Silas Jenkins gave him a wide berth. "You have far to go?" he asked finally, nodding toward the bundles at her feet, all that remained of her possessions after selling most everything to pay her husband's debts. "The stagecoach leaves at dawn," Patience replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm heading east to my cousin in St. Louis," Thomas frowned. "That's Sioux territory you'll be crossing. The army's been stirring up trouble again." Patience felt her stomach clench. She knew the risks, but what choice did she have? Her husband Jacob had left her with nothing but debts and promises, dying of pneumonia before he could strike it rich in the silver mines he'd been so certain would deliver their fortune. "I have to try," she said simply. "There's nothing left for us here." Thomas seemed about to say something more when Emma's fussing turned to outright wailing. Patience struggled to manage both her crying infant and the bundles at her feet. "Here," Thomas said gruffly, reaching for the child. "Let me." Instinctively, Patience pulled back. "I won't harm her," he said, and something in his eyes, a glimpse of unexpected gentleness, made Patience relent. She watched, astonished, as the fearsome gunslinger cradled her daughter with surprising tenderness. Emma's cries immediately began to subside as Thomas rocked her with practiced ease. "You've got a place in my life now," the cowboy said as he took her baby in his arms, his voice so soft Patience barely caught the words. He looked up, catching her questioning gaze, and cleared his throat. "I meant the little one. She reminds me of someone I once knew." There was a story there, Patience thought, but she knew better than to pry. Out west, everyone had a past and most preferred to keep it buried. "You shouldn't travel alone," Thomas said abruptly. "It's not safe." "I don't have the means to hire protection, Mr. Blackwood." He stared at her for a long moment, then down at Emma, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "You won't need to. I'm heading east myself. Could use the company." Patience's breath caught. "I couldn't possibly accept." "It's not charity, Mrs. Miller. The trails are dangerous and I've been meaning to move on anyway." His expression hardened. "Unless you'd prefer taking your chances with the likes of Jenkins and his kind." Patience studied the man before her. Thomas Blackwood was dangerous, there was no question about that. The worn gun belt and the calluses on his trigger finger spoke of years spent surviving by whatever means necessary. But he had shown her kindness when others had not, and the way he held Emma. "Why would you help us?" She asked directly. Thomas's expression was unreadable. "Let's just say I've seen what happens to women and children alone on the frontier. It doesn't end well." Patience considered her options, which were painfully few. Stay in Redemption Springs and eventually be forced to accept Silas Jenkins's protection, with all that entailed. Or trust this stranger, this gunslinger with secrets in his eyes, who somehow knew how to calm a fussing baby. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally. "We leave at dawn." Thomas nodded, carefully handing Emma back to her mother. "I'll come for you at first light. Pack only what you need, will travel light and fast." As Patience watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering dusk, she wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake or found her salvation. Dawn broke cold and clear over Redemption Springs. Patience had barely slept, dividing her night between tending to Emma and wondering if Thomas Blackwood would actually appear as promised. Men's words came cheap in the West, especially to widows with nothing to offer but gratitude. She needn't have worried. As the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky, a soft knock came at her door. Thomas stood outside with 2 horses, his own powerful black stallion and a sturdy chestnut mare. "The stagecoach route is too predictable," he explained when she questioned him about the change in plans. "Bandits know the schedule, will make better time and stay safer on horseback." Patience eyed the mare uncertainly. "I haven't ridden since I was a girl." "She's gentle," Thomas assured her, patting the horse's neck. "And I'll fashion a sling for Emma so you can carry her securely." With efficient movements, he helped Patience secure her meager belongings to the saddle. From a leather pouch, he produced strips of soft buckskin and quickly fashioned an ingenious carrier that would hold Emma safely against Patience's chest while leaving her hands free for the reins. "Where did you learn to make something like this?" Patience asked, impressed by his handiwork. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "Spent some time with the Cheyenne," was all he said. They left Redemption Springs as the town was just beginning to stir. Patience felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension as the collection of wooden buildings receded behind them. For 3 years, that dusty frontier town had been her home, the place where she had arrived as a hopeful bride and was now leaving as a destitute widow. Thomas set a steady pace, not too fast but with clear purpose. He rode slightly ahead, constantly scanning the horizon and occasionally doubling back to ensure they weren't being followed. Patience found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the straight set of his shoulders, the weathered lines around his eyes that suggested he was perhaps in his mid-30s, the way he held himself with controlled vigilance. "How far to St. Louis?" she asked when they stopped at midday to rest the horses and feed Emma. 6 weeks. If the weather holds and we don't run into trouble," Thomas replied, checking his Winchester rifle before returning it to its scabbard. "We'll follow the North Platte to Fort Laramie, then cut southeast toward the Missouri River." Patience nodded, trying to hide her dismay at the length of the journey ahead. She had known it would be a long trek, but hearing it stated so plainly made the task seem almost insurmountable. Thomas must have read her expression. "Your cousin, she's expecting you. I wrote to her after Jacob died," Patience admitted. "But whether the letter reached her, I can't say. Martha and I were close as children, but it's been years since we've corresponded regularly. And if she's not there, or can't take you in," the question hung in the air, voicing the fear Patience had been trying to ignore. "Then I'll find work," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I can sew, cook, clean. I'm not afraid of hard work." Thomas said nothing to this, but his skeptical expression spoke volumes. They both knew the limited options available to a young widow with a child and no connections. "What about you, Mr. Blackwood?" Patience asked, partly to change the subject. "What business takes you east?" "Just Thomas," he corrected, And I've got no particular business, just time to move on. Running from something or toward something? The words slipped out before Patience could reconsider their boldness. Thomas's eyes narrowed, but after a moment, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Bit of both, maybe. Isn't that true for most folks heading somewhere new? They made camp that evening in a small grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. Thomas efficiently set about building a small fire while Patience tended to Emma. The baby had been remarkably good-natured throughout the day's journey, seeming to enjoy the gentle rocking motion of the horse's gait. "She's a good traveler," Thomas observed, watching as Patience changed Emma's cloth diaper. "She's her father's daughter," Patience said softly. Jacob could never stay in one place for long. Always restless, always certain the next valley held the fortune that would make us rich. "That's what brought you out west, the promise of riches," Patience smiled sadly. "Jacob had dreams big enough for both of us. I just wanted a home, maybe a garden patch, but I loved him, so I followed." Thomas nodded, turning his attention back to the fire. "Dreams have led many a good man to an early grave out here." "What about you?" Patience asked. "What were your dreams?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, once thought I might have a ranch of my own, raise horses." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Didn't work out that way." Before Patience could inquire further, a sound in the distance made Thomas tense. He immediately doused the fire, his hand going to his holster. "Take Emma and go to the trees," he ordered in a low voice. "Stay hidden until I call for you." Heart pounding, Patience gathered her drowsy daughter and retreated into the shadows of the cottonwoods. From her hiding place, she could see Thomas moving silently toward the edge of their small camp. His gun drawn, minutes ticked by in tense silence. Then came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, several horses, moving at a walk rather than a gallop, which suggested they weren't in immediate pursuit of something. Patience held her breath, pressing Emma to her chest and praying the baby wouldn't choose this moment to cry. Thomas melted into the darkness so completely that even Patience, who knew where he had been standing, could no longer see him. The riders, 3 of them, from the sound came closer, their voices carrying in the still evening air. "Told you I saw smoke," one was saying. "Someone's camped nearby." "Probably just travelers like us," another replied. "Or it could be that gunslinger from Redemption Springs," said a third voice that made Patience's blood run cold. "Silas Jenkins. Word is he left town with the Miller widow this morning. What do you want with some woman and her brat?" The first voice asked. "That's my business," Jenkins replied. "But Blackwood's got a price on his head in Colorado, $500 for the man who brings him in. Dead or alive, Judge didn't specify," Jenkins said with a chuckle. "But dead's a lot easier to transport." Patience's heart hammered in her chest. Thomas was wanted, for what crime? And Jenkins had followed them, was still hunting them. She clutched Emma tighter, terrified that the baby would wake and give away their position. The riders came into view at the edge of the clearing, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Jenkins was in the lead, his bulldog profile unmistakable even in the dim light. The men dismounted, examining the remains of the hastily extinguished fire. "Still warm," one said. "They can't be far." Jenkins drew his gun. "Spread out, find them." Patience bit her lip to keep from crying out. Emma stirred against her chest, making small waking sounds. Desperately, Patience tried to soothe her, knowing that discovery meant certain danger for them both. A shot rang out, startling both Patience and Emma, who began to wail in earnest. One of Jenkins's companions fell, clutching his shoulder. A second shot sent the other man diving for cover. "That's far enough, Jenkins," Thomas called from somewhere to Patience's left. "I've got no quarrel with you, but you're making one with me." "Come out, Blackwood," Jenkins shouted, firing blindly in the direction of Thomas's voice. "We can settle this like men. 3 against 1 ain't exactly fair odds," Thomas replied, his voice now coming from a different direction. "But I'm willing to let you ride away. Just leave the woman and child out of whatever grudge you're nursing." Jenkins laughed. "The woman's my business, you're just a bonus. $500 to add to my winnings." "What winnings would those be?" Thomas's voice had moved again, circling behind Jenkins. Her husband owed me money, lost it fair and square at my tables. I'm just collecting what's mine. Patience gasped. Jacob had sworn he'd stopped gambling, had promised her after losing their savings the first time. But clearly he had continued in secret, leaving her not just penniless but in debt to a man like Silas Jenkins. The debt died with him, Thomas said flatly. Not the way I see it, Jenkins replied. But I'm a reasonable man. The widow can work it off. I've got an establishment where pretty women can earn good money. The implication was clear and Patience felt sick. She pressed a hand over Emma's mouth, trying to muffle her cries, but it was too late. Jenkins's head swiveled toward the sound. There you are, he said with malicious satisfaction, advancing toward the trees where Patience hid. Before he could take 3 steps, Thomas emerged from the shadows directly behind him, pressing his gun to the back of Jenkins's head. Drop it, he ordered. Jenkins froze, then slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. His remaining companion, seeing the situation, backed away toward the horses. Now, Thomas said, his voice deadly calm, you're going to get on your horse and ride back to Redemption Springs. You're going to forget about any debts you think you're owed, and you're going to pray I never see your face again, because if I do, I'll finish what we started here. You can't run forever, Blackwood, Jenkins spat. That bounty on your head will only grow, someone will collect it eventually. Maybe, but it won't be you. Thomas stepped back, keeping his gun trained on Jenkins. Now go. Jenkins hesitated, clearly calculating his odds, then evidently thought better of it. He backed toward his horse, helping his wounded companion mount before climbing into his own saddle. This isn't over, he warned before spurring his horse and riding off into the night, his remaining men following close behind. Thomas waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before holstering his weapon and approaching Patience's hiding place. You can come out now, he said. They're gone. Patience emerged from the trees, Emma still crying in her arms. She faced Thomas, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. You're wanted, she said, her voice shaking. There's a bounty on you. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Yes, for what? He met her gaze steadily. I killed a man in Denver, a mine owner who was working his men to death for starvation wages. My brother was one of them. Was it murder? Patience asked directly. The law calls it that, Thomas replied. I call it justice. He had my brother beaten to death for organizing the others, demanding safer conditions. Patience absorbed this, gently bouncing Emma to soothe her cries. And Jacob, did he really owe Jenkins money? Thomas's expression softened. Most likely, men like Jenkins prey on dreamers like your husband. Easy to get them to the tables, hard to get them to leave before they've lost everything. Patience felt tears stinging her eyes. Even in death, Jacob was still causing her pain, still putting her in danger with his reckless choices. She had loved him, yes, but in this moment, she also felt a surge of anger toward the man who had left her so vulnerable. We should move, Thomas said, glancing around. Jenkins might come back with more men. Why are you helping us? Patience asked, the question that had been nagging at her since he first intervened on her behalf. You're taking a risk, traveling with a woman and child when you're wanted. We're slowing you down. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his face half hidden in shadow. I had a wife once, he finally said, and a daughter. Cholera took them both while I was away, working in the mines to give them a better life. His voice was flat, as if reciting facts that had happened to someone else. No one helped them when they needed it. I wasn't there. The simple tragedy of it struck Patience deeply. She looked down at Emma, now quieting in her arms, and felt a surge of empathy for this man who had lost everything. I'm sorry, she said softly. Thomas nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. We need to pack up. We'll ride through the night to put distance between us and Jenkins. As they quickly gathered their belongings, Patience found herself reevaluating the man she had entrusted with her and Emma's safety. A killer, yes, but also a man driven by his own code of justice and honor. A dangerous man, certainly, but dangerous primarily to those who threatened the vulnerable. She didn't know if she could trust him completely, but she understood him better now. And in the harsh realities of the frontier, understanding was perhaps more valuable than trust. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and tend to Emma's needs. Thomas set a grueling pace, determined to put as much distance as possible between them and any potential pursuers. By dawn, they had traveled nearly 20 miles, crossing into territory where Jenkins's influence wouldn't reach. Patience was exhausted, her body aching from hours in the saddle. Emma, remarkably, had slept for much of the journey, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of the sling against her mother's chest. When Thomas finally called a halt near a small stream sheltered by a ridge of rocky hills, Patience nearly fell from her saddle in fatigue. Thomas caught her arm, steadying her. "You should rest," he said, concern evident in his voice. "I'll keep watch." "You need sleep too," Patience protested, even as she sank gratefully onto a fallen log. "I'm used to going without," he replied, unsaddling the horses and leading them to water. "Been doing it most of my life." Despite her exhaustion, Patience found herself watching him as he efficiently set up a small camp, moving with the economical grace of a man accustomed to life on the trail. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, the way he anticipated needs before they arose. "You should eat something," he said, offering her jerky and hardtack from his provisions. "Keep up your strength for the little one." Patience accepted the food, suddenly aware of her hunger. "What happened to your brother?" she asked after taking a few bites. After the mine owner, Thomas's expression darkened. "They buried him in an unmarked grave, said he started a riot, though all he did was speak up when a support beam collapsed and killed 2 men. He stared into the distance. "Daniel was always the one who couldn't stand by when he saw injustice. Got that from our father, I suppose. And you," a grim smile touched his lips. "I was always the one who settled scores." Patience shifted Emma to her other arm, considering this. "What will you do when we reach St. Louis?" "You can't keep running forever." "Been managing it for 3 years so far," Thomas replied. "There's always work for a man who knows horses and can handle a gun. Further east, fewer questions get asked." "Is that the life you want?" Patience pressed. "Always looking over your shoulder, never putting down roots." Thomas gave her a measured look. "What I want stopped mattering the day I buried my wife and daughter. Now I just do what needs doing." The bleakness in his voice stirred something in Patience, a recognition of shared grief, perhaps, or simply compassion for this man who had lost his way after losing his family. She understood all too well the feeling of being adrift, of having carefully laid plans shattered by circumstances beyond control. "What were their names?" she asked softly. "Your wife and daughter." For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, Sarah was my wife. Our girl was called Rose." He said the names carefully, as if they were fragile things that might break if handled roughly. Rose had just turned 2 when the sickness came. About Emma's age, Patience realized with a pang. No wonder he had been so gentle with her daughter from the first moment. "They would be proud of you," she said, "for helping us." Thomas made a non-committal sound, turning away to check the horses again, but Patience had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of emotion quickly suppressed, but present nonetheless. They rested for several hours, with Thomas taking the first watch while Patience and Emma slept in the shelter of a small lean-to he constructed from branches and his spare blanket. When she woke, she found him sitting exactly where she had left him, his rifle across his knees, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Your turn," she said, emerging from the lean-to with Emma in her arms. "I'll watch while you sleep." Thomas shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're no good to any of us if you collapse from exhaustion," Patience said firmly. "And I'm quite capable of keeping watch. Jacob taught me how to shoot." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" "I'm not helpless, Mr. Blackwood," she said with a touch of pride. "I've lived on the frontier for 3 years. I can handle a gun if needed." After a moment's consideration, Thomas handed her his revolver. 6 shots, he said. If you see or hear anything suspicious, wake me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." "I'm not a fool," Patience replied, accepting the weapon with practiced ease. "Now sleep. We've got a long journey ahead." To her surprise, Thomas complied, stretching out in the lean-to she had vacated. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened, though she noticed he positioned himself so that he could spring up at a moment's notice, his own rifle within easy reach. Patience settled herself on the log where Thomas had kept his vigil, Emma contentedly playing with a small wooden toy Thomas had carved for her the previous evening. The weight of the revolver was reassuring in her lap, though she prayed she wouldn't need to use it. As she watched over the sleeping man who had become their unexpected protector, Patience found herself wondering about the path that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been a hopeful young bride leaving her family's comfortable farm in Missouri, following her adventurous husband west with dreams of prosperity and excitement. Now she was returning east, widowed and penniless, dependent on the protection of a wanted man with his own troubled past. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns. Perhaps that was the true lesson of the frontier, that no path was certain, no future guaranteed. All one could do was face each day with courage and adapt to whatever circumstances arose. Patience looked down at Emma, who was drifting back to sleep in the makeshift sling. At least her daughter would have opportunities back east that the frontier couldn't provide: education, stability, perhaps even some semblance of gentility. And if her cousin, Martha, couldn't or wouldn't take them in, well, Patience would find another way. She had survived this far, she would continue to do so. Her gaze drifted back to Thomas's sleeping form. What place would he have in their future once they reached St. Louis? Would he simply see them safely delivered and then disappear, continuing his solitary existence on the fringes of society? The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. In just 2 days, he had become important to them both, not just as a protector, but as something more. A friend, perhaps, or potentially something deeper, a possibility Patience wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. She shook her head, dismissing such thoughts as foolishness born of stress and gratitude. Thomas Blackwood had his own path to follow, just as she had hers. Their journeys had intersected briefly, but would inevitably diverge again. Still, as she kept her vigilant watch over their small camp, Patience couldn't help but wonder what might have been under different circumstances if they had met before grief and hardship had shaped them both, before the weight of the past had made trust such a precious and rare commodity. The days fell into a pattern as they continued their journey eastward. They traveled steadily, avoiding main trails and settlements where possible, camping each night in sheltered locations Thomas selected with careful attention to defensibility and access to water. Emma thrived despite the rigors of travel, growing more alert and responsive each day. Thomas proved to be a surprising companion. Though still reserved, he gradually revealed aspects of himself through small gestures and occasional conversation. He was unfailingly gentle with Emma, fashioning toys for her from bits of wood and leather, singing old trail songs in a surprisingly melodious baritone when he thought Patience wasn't listening. With Patience, he maintained a respectful distance, always courteous but careful not to presume or impose. Yet she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that suggested he was seeing someone else, perhaps remembering his lost wife, or simply marveling at the resilience Patience displayed in the face of adversity. A week into their journey, they encountered their first significant obstacle. Spring rains had swollen the North Platte River beyond its banks, making the usual ford impassable. Thomas scouted for miles in both directions, seeking an alternative crossing, but found none that would be safe for a woman with a child. "We'll need to wait for the waters to recede," he said when he returned to their makeshift camp. "Could be a day, could be longer." Patience nodded, understanding the necessity but frustrated by the delay. Each day spent on the trail was another day of depleting their limited supplies, another day of exposure to the elements and potential dangers. The forced halt in their journey created an unexpected intimacy. With no pressing need to break camp and move on, they found themselves with time to simply be in each other's company. Thomas built a more substantial shelter against the continuing rain, a lean-to large enough for Patience, Emma, and himself, though he insisted on sleeping nearest the opening, ever vigilant. On the second evening of their delay, as rain drummed steadily on the branches above them and Emma slept peacefully between them, Thomas spoke more openly than he had before. "I was born in Kentucky," he said, his voice low so as not to wake the baby. "My father was a horse breeder before the war. Had a small but respectable operation. Mother died when Daniel and I were young. I was 10, he was 8. Father never remarried, raised us on his own." Patience listened, sensing that these confidences were rare and valuable. "What happened to the horse farm?" "Lost it during the war. Father refused to sell horses to either side, said he wouldn't provide mounts for men to kill each other. Union forces requisitioned them anyway, left us with nothing but promissory notes that were never honored." Thomas's face hardened at the memory. "Father died of heart failure the year after the war ended. Daniel and I headed west, looking for a fresh start. And you found the mines instead," Patience said softly. Thomas nodded. "Good money if you didn't mind the danger. We worked hard, saved every penny. I met Sarah in a boarding house in Denver. She was a schoolteacher, far too refined for the likes of me, but somehow she saw something worth loving." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We married within 6 months. Rose came along a year later." "She sounds wonderful," Patience said, genuine warmth in her voice. "She was." Thomas's expression grew distant. "We had 2 good years together. I was working toward buying land somewhere we could raise horses like my father had. Then the cholera came through Denver." He fell silent, lost in painful memories. After a respectful pause, Patience offered her own story in return. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. My father grew wheat and raised a few cattle. Nothing grand, but we never went hungry. I was the middle child, 2 brothers older, 1 sister younger. Mother taught us all to read, insisted on it even when father said girls had no need of books." Thomas turned to look at her with interest. "And did you like books?" Patience smiled. "Loved them. Would read anything I could get my hands on. Adventure stories were my favorite, tales of far-off places and extraordinary happenings." She glanced down at Emma. "I hope to give her the same love of reading someday." "How did you meet your husband?" Thomas asked. "Jacob came through our town selling farm equipment. He was handsome, full of grand tales about the West and its opportunities." Patience sighed, remembering her younger self's infatuation. "My parents didn't approve, thought he was all talk, but I was 21 and thought I knew better." "Were they right?" Patience considered this. "Yes and no. Jacob wasn't a bad man, just a dreamer who couldn't seem to make his dreams align with reality. He truly believed each new venture would be the one to make us rich." She stroked Emma's soft hair. "But he gave me her, so I can't regret it, not really." Thomas nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. "Life rarely follows the path we expect." "No," Patience agreed. "Though sometimes the unexpected path leads to places we wouldn't have found otherwise." Their eyes met in the dim light of their shelter, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits brought together by circumstance, but finding unexpected connection in shared understanding. The moment was broken when Emma stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Patience automatically reached to soothe her, her hand brushing against Thomas's as he did the same. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, a reminder of how long it had been since she had experienced such a simple human touch. "You should rest," Thomas said, withdrawing his hand. "I'll keep watch." Patience nodded, settling back with Emma in her arms, but sleep was slow to come as she pondered the changing nature of her feelings toward the man sharing their shelter, a man who had begun as a stranger and was rapidly becoming something far more complex in her life. The river receded enough for crossing 3 days later. Thomas fashioned a small raft from logs and branches to carry their provisions, swimming alongside to guide it while Patience crossed on her mare with Emma securely fastened to her chest. The crossing was tense but successful, and they continued their journey with renewed purpose. As they traveled, Thomas began teaching Patience survival skills: how to read the landscape for signs of water, how to identify edible plants, how to make fire even in damp conditions. She proved an apt pupil, eager to learn anything that might help her protect Emma in the uncertain future. In return, Patience shared stories from the books she had loved, reciting from memory passages that had stayed with her over the years. Thomas listened with evident enjoyment, sometimes asking questions that revealed his own thoughtful nature despite his limited formal education. They had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks when disaster struck. While crossing a narrow ravine, Patience's mare stepped into a hidden hole, stumbling badly. Though Thomas reacted quickly, catching Emma as Patience was thrown from the saddle, the horse's leg was broken beyond repair. Thomas did what was necessary quickly and mercifully, putting the suffering animal down with a single shot. Patience turned away, tears streaming down her face not just for the horse, but for what this meant for their journey. "We can't continue with just one mount," she said when she had composed herself, Emma clutched tightly in her arms. "We'll manage," Thomas replied, his expression grim but determined. "My horse can carry double for a while. We're not far from Fort Laramie. We can purchase another mount there." "With what money?" Patience asked. "I have barely enough to establish ourselves in St. Louis, and that's assuming Martha can help us with lodging." Thomas was silent for a moment. "I have some funds set aside," he finally said. "Enough for another horse at least." Patience stared at him. "I can't accept that. You've done too much already." "It's not charity," Thomas said firmly. "It's necessity. We started this journey together, we'll finish it together." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a determination that both reassured and confused Patience. Why was he so committed to seeing them safely to St. Louis? Was it merely the sense of responsibility he had assumed when he first offered his protection, or was there something more developing between them? The question remained unspoken as they salvaged what they could from Patience's saddle and gear, redistributing the weight to Thomas's stallion. The horse was strong but would tire quickly under the burden of 2 adults and their provisions. They would need to proceed more slowly, making their journey even longer than originally planned. That night, as they made camp in the shelter of a small copse of trees, Patience finally voiced the concern that had been growing in her mind. "If Jenkins truly put out word about you, Fort Laramie could be dangerous. The army might recognize you from descriptions." Thomas nodded, his expression somber. "I've considered that, but we need another horse and there are few other options in this territory." "Then let me go alone," Patience suggested. "I can purchase the horse while you wait outside the fort's boundaries." "Too risky," Thomas immediately replied. "You'd be vulnerable." "I'm not helpless," Patience reminded him, "and no one is looking for me." A widow with a child will attract far less attention than a man matching the description of a wanted gunslinger. Thomas considered this, clearly reluctant but seeing the logic in her argument. "You'd need money. You could provide that if you're truly determined to help us continue." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "I don't like it." "I don't particularly like it either," Patience admitted, "but I see no better alternative." After further discussion, they developed a plan. Thomas would accompany her to within sight of the fort, but remain hidden while Patience went in alone, posing as a woman separated from a wagon train due to her horse's injury. She would purchase a suitable mount and supplies, then return to their rendezvous point. 2 days later, they reached the vicinity of Fort Laramie. Thomas selected a concealed position with a good view of the fort's main entrance, where he could observe without being seen. Before Patience departed, he pressed a leather pouch containing gold coins into her hand. "Be careful," he said, his voice rough with concern. If anything seems wrong, anything at all, leave immediately. We'll find another way. Patience nodded, surprisingly touched by his worry. I'll be fine. Keep Emma safe until I return. Thomas glanced down at the baby, now contentedly playing with a strand of his hair from her position in the sling he wore. With my life, he promised solemnly. Patience began the walk toward Fort Laramie, glancing back once to see Thomas already settling into his hiding place, Emma secure against his chest. The sight gave her a curious feeling, as if she were leaving part of her heart behind with them. Fort Laramie proved to be a bustling outpost, filled with soldiers, traders, and travelers of all descriptions. Patience kept her story simple and adhered to it consistently, finding that her status as a young widow with a child in need generated sympathy rather than suspicion. She located a stable master willing to sell her a sturdy gelding for a fair price, and even managed to purchase additional supplies without depleting Thomas's funds entirely. As she was preparing to leave, her business concluded more quickly than anticipated. She overheard a conversation between two soldiers that made her blood run cold. Heard they're bringing in some gunslinger from Colorado, one was saying. Killed some big shot mine owner a few years back. Word is he's traveling with a woman and child heading east. What's the bounty? Asked his companion. 500 originally, but I heard it's up to 1,000 now. Seems the mine owner had powerful friends. Patience forced herself to continue walking naturally, not betraying the panic rising within her. $1,000 was an enormous sum, enough to tempt even those who might otherwise look the other way. And if the authorities were actively searching for Thomas rather than merely responding to wanted posters, their danger had increased exponentially. She completed her purchase of the gelding and led it out of the fort, maintaining a casual pace despite her urgency to return to Thomas and Emma. Only when she was well out of sight of the sentries did she quicken her steps, leading the horse toward their arranged meeting place with growing anxiety. Thomas emerged from his hiding place as she approached, relief evident in his expression. Emma, seeing her mother, reached out with eager hands, babbling happily. "Any trouble?" Thomas asked, handing Emma over to Patience while examining the new horse with an expert eye. "We need to move," Patience said quietly. "The bounty on your head has doubled and they're actively searching for you. They know you're traveling with a woman and child." Thomas's expression hardened. "How far is their search extending?" "I don't know, but we can't risk staying in this area." Patience bounced Emma gently, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thomas, $1,000 will bring out every bounty hunter and lawman between here and the Mississippi." He nodded grimly. "We'll change course, head northeast for a while before turning east again. Stay away from settlements and known trails." "Will that be enough?" Thomas met her gaze directly. "It has to be." They rode hard for the remainder of the day, Thomas leading them on a circuitous route designed to confuse any potential pursuers. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 20 miles, veering well away from their original path toward a region of rolling hills and scattered woodlands that offered better concealment. As they made camp that night, Patience could see the strain in Thomas's face, the weight of responsibility and concern for their safety evident in the tightness around his eyes. Emma, sensing the tension, was fussier than usual, refusing to settle even after being fed and changed. "Let me," Thomas said, reaching for the crying infant. Patience relinquished her daughter, watching as Thomas cradled Emma against his shoulder, his large hand gently patting her back as he paced slowly around their small campsite. "You're safe, little one," he murmured, his deep voice a soothing rumble. "Your mama and I won't let anything happen to you." The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, brought tears to Patience's eyes. In the short time they had been traveling together, Thomas had become not just their protector, but a genuine partner in ensuring Emma's welfare. He looked after the child with the devotion of a father, anticipating her needs and finding joy in her smallest developments. And his concern extended to Patience as well, not just for her physical safety, but for her comfort and peace of mind. He sought her opinions, respected her decisions, treated her as an equal in ways Jacob never had. In the harshest of circumstances, he had shown her consistent kindness and consideration. As Thomas continued to pace with Emma, who was finally beginning to quiet, Patience found herself confronting the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with this complex, honorable man who had entered their lives so unexpectedly. The realization should have frightened her. Thomas was a wanted man living outside the law. Their future was uncertain at best, perilous at worst. Yet instead of fear, Patience felt a curious sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally fitting together. She said nothing of these thoughts, however, as Thomas returned with a now sleeping Emma and carefully placed her in the makeshift bed they had arranged. "She's exhausted herself," he said with a small smile. "Should sleep soundly now." "Thank you," Patience replied, meaning it for far more than just his help with Emma. Thomas nodded, then turned to check their horses one final time before settling down near the entrance of their shelter, his rifle within easy reach as always. Patience watched him, wondering if he ever allowed himself to hope for more than mere survival, if he ever envisioned a future where he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder. "Thomas," she said softly, making a sudden decision, "when we reach St. Louis, what will you do?" He glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Move on, I suppose, maybe further east or possibly north into Canada." Always alone, his expression grew guarded. "It's safer that way, for everyone." Patience took a deep breath. "What if it isn't? What if there could be another option?" Thomas went very still, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that might have been unsettling if Patience hadn't come to know him so well. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm suggesting that perhaps Emma and I could go with you," Patience said, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Not to St. Louis, but wherever you decide to go next." For a long moment, Thomas said nothing, his expression unreadable in the dim light of their small fire. Then he shook his head slowly. "You don't know what you're asking. The life I lead isn't one you'd want for yourself or your daughter." "I'm not asking for certainty or comfort," Patience replied. "I'm suggesting that perhaps we're stronger together than apart. That perhaps what we've found on this journey is worth preserving." "And what is it you think we've found?" Thomas asked, an edge of something hope, fear in his voice. "Partnership," Patience said simply. "Understanding, a kind of belonging that I, at least, haven't experienced before." She paused, gathering her courage. "I care for you, Thomas, more than I expected to, more than might be wise given our circumstances, but I believe you care for us too." Thomas's expression softened, vulnerability showing through his usual reserve. "I do," he admitted quietly. "God help me, I do. But that's precisely why I can't let you tie your fate to mine. You deserve better safety, stability, a life without looking over your shoulder for danger." "What I deserve is the right to choose my own path," Patience countered. "I've followed others' expectations my entire life, my parents', then Jacob's. For once, I want to make a decision based on what I truly want, not what others think is best for me." "And you want a life on the run with a wanted man?" Thomas asked incredulously. "I want a life with a man I trust," Patience corrected. "A man who has shown me more consideration and respect in 2 weeks than my husband did in 3 years. A man who looks at my daughter with love in his eyes." She moved closer to him, daring to place her hand on his arm. "The rest we can figure out together." Thomas covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle but his expression troubled. "It's not that simple." "No," Patience agreed, "but few worthwhile things are." He gazed at her for a long moment, then at Emma's sleeping form. "I need time to think," he finally said. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." Patience nodded, understanding his caution even as she felt a pang of disappointment at his lack of immediate agreement. "Of course, we still have many miles ahead of us." Thomas squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "Get some rest. I'll take first watch." As Patience settled down beside Emma, she wondered if she had been too bold, too presumptuous in voicing her feelings. Yet she couldn't bring herself to regret her honesty. Whatever came next, whether Thomas ultimately accepted or rejected her proposal, at least she had been true to her heart. The following days brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Though Thomas didn't refer directly to their conversation, his actions spoke of deeper consideration for their shared future. He began teaching Patience more intensively not just survival skills now, but how to detect if they were being followed, how to cover their tracks, how to identify potential dangers before they became immediate threats. Knowledge a woman would need if she were to live the kind of life he led. In quiet moments, he spoke more openly of his past, filling in the gaps of his history that Patience had only glimpsed before. He told her of his time with the Cheyenne after losing his family, how they had taught him ways of moving through the landscape that few white men understood. He spoke of the jobs he had taken, some honorable, others less so, and the places he had seen in his years of wandering. In return, Patience shared her own hopes and fears, her concern for Emma's future, her desire to provide her daughter with opportunities she herself had never had, her struggle to reconcile the romantic dreams of her youth with the harsher realities of frontier life. Emma continued to flourish despite the rigors of travel, growing more adventurous and vocal with each passing day. She had formed a deep attachment to Thomas, reaching for him whenever he was near, falling asleep most peacefully when cradled in his strong arms. He, in turn, displayed a patience and tenderness with the child that revealed the father he might have been under different circumstances. They avoided settlements entirely now, making a wide detour around any sign of civilization. Their progress was slower but steadier, each day bringing them closer to the Missouri River and the decision point that loomed in their future: continue east to St. Louis as originally planned, or chart a new course together. They had been traveling for nearly a month when fate intervened in an unexpected way. While crossing a seemingly abandoned stretch of prairie, they encountered a small family, a man, woman, and 2 young children stranded beside a broken wagon. The man was attempting to repair a shattered axle, while the woman tended to a child who appeared feverish and listless. Thomas's first instinct was to avoid them, wary of any contact that might lead to his identification. But Patience, seeing the distress of the young mother, could not ride past without offering assistance. "They need help," she said quietly. "That child looks seriously ill." Thomas hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll stop, but be careful what you say." No names, no details about where we're headed. They approached cautiously, Thomas hanging back slightly while Patience rode forward with Emma. The family looked up with evident relief at the sight of potential help. "Thank the Lord," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've been stuck here for 2 days. Axle broke clean through and our boy took sick the same night." Patience dismounted, handing Emma to Thomas before approaching the woman and her ailing child. The boy, perhaps 4 years old, was burning with fever, his breathing labored. "How long has he been like this?" Patience asked, placing a gentle hand on the child's forehead. "Started with just a cough," the woman replied, her face drawn with worry. "Got worse yesterday. Won't take water now, just tosses and cries." Patience recognized the symptoms: pneumonia, most likely, the same illness that had taken Jacob. Without proper treatment, the child's chances were poor. She turned to Thomas, who had approached with Emma while maintaining a watchful eye on their surroundings. "The boy needs a doctor," she said quietly. Thomas nodded, his expression grave. "Nearest settlement is Fort Kearney, about 20 miles east." The man overheard them. "We were heading there when the wagon broke down. I've been trying to fix it, but—" He gestured helplessly at his makeshift repair attempts. Thomas studied the damaged axle, then looked at the family's drawn faces. Patience could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the risk of exposure against the certain death of the child if they did nothing. "Your boy won't last another day without medical attention," he finally said. "I can take him and your wife to Fort Kearney on my horse. You'll need to stay with your daughter and the wagon." Relief and gratitude washed over the man's face. "God bless you, sir." "We didn't know what we were going to do," Thomas, Patience said in a low voice, using his name despite his earlier caution. "The risk, I know," he cut her off, "but I can't let a child die when I might prevent it." His eyes met hers, conveying a silent message. "This is who I am. This is the choice I make." In that moment, Patience's affection for him deepened immeasurably. Despite the danger to himself, he couldn't turn away from a family in need, couldn't ignore the suffering of a child who reminded him, perhaps, of the daughter he had lost. "I'll go with them," Patience decided. "You're more likely to be recognized. I can get the boy to a doctor while you wait with Emma and the man's daughter." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. If something happened, nothing will happen," Patience insisted. "I'll be more believable as a concerned neighbor helping a mother with a sick child. No one is looking for me." The logic of her argument was inescapable, though Thomas clearly hated the idea of separation. After further discussion, they agreed. Patience would take the mother and sick child to Fort Kearney on Thomas's horse, while Thomas remained behind with Emma, the man, and his young daughter to attempt repairs on the wagon. As Patience prepared to depart, Thomas drew her aside. "Be careful," he said, his voice low and intense. "If there's any sign of trouble, any at all, you turn around and come back immediately." "I will," she promised, touched by his concern. "You have until tomorrow morning," he continued. "If you're not back by then, I'll come looking for you." Patience nodded, understanding the risk such an action would pose for him. "I'll be back before nightfall if possible." Thomas hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and extracted a small Derringer pistol. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand, "just in case." Patience tucked the weapon into her pocket, hoping she wouldn't need it but grateful for the precaution. She turned to take Emma from Thomas's arms, holding her daughter close for a moment. "Be good for Thomas," she whispered, kissing the baby's soft cheek before reluctantly handing her back. Thomas cradled Emma with practiced ease, his expression softening as he looked down at her. "We'll be fine," he assured Patience. "She's in good hands." "I know," Patience replied simply. Their eyes held for a long moment, conveying emotions too complex for words. Then Patience turned away, helping the worried mother mount Thomas's horse before climbing up behind her, the sick child cradled between them. As she rode away, Patience glanced back once to see Thomas standing with Emma in his arms, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the prairie. The image stayed with her as she urged the horse eastward, a talisman of everything she hoped to return to. Fort Kearney proved to be a small but well-established military outpost, with a resident doctor who immediately took charge of the sick child. While the mother remained at her son's bedside, Patience set about arranging for a repair wagon to return with her to assist the stranded family. She was careful to maintain her cover story, presenting herself as a neighbor who had been traveling to visit relatives when she encountered the family in distress. The soldiers and settlers she interacted with accepted this explanation without question. Their concern focused on the ailing child rather than the circumstances that had brought him to their attention. By the time arrangements were complete, night had fallen, making travel back to the stranded wagon too dangerous to attempt. Though anxious to return to Thomas and Emma, Patience recognized the necessity of waiting until morning. The fort's commander kindly offered her lodging for the night, which she accepted with appropriate gratitude. As she prepared for bed in the small guest quarters, Patience found herself missing Emma with an almost physical ache. She had never been separated from her daughter overnight before, and though she trusted Thomas completely with Emma's care, the distance between them felt wrong somehow, as if a piece of herself were missing. And she missed Thomas too. She realized his quiet strength, his watchful presence, the sense of security she felt in his company. In the month they had traveled together, he had become essential to her in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Patience slept fitfully, waking before dawn with a sense of urgency. She roused the repair crew that had been assigned to help the stranded family, insisting on an early departure despite their grumbling. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were well on their way, a wagon loaded with tools and a spare axle following Patience as she led them back to where she had left Thomas and the others. As they approached the site, Patience felt a surge of relief at the sight of smoke from a small campfire, then immediate alarm as she realized Thomas was nowhere to be seen. The stranded man was tending the fire while his daughter played nearby, but there was no sign of Thomas or Emma. Patience dismounted quickly, her heart pounding. "Where are they?" she demanded without preamble. "The man and my baby, where are they?" The man looked up, his expression grim. "Soldiers came through late yesterday, not long after you left. Said they were looking for a fugitive traveling with a woman and child." Patience felt the blood drain from her face. "What happened?" "Your friend took your little one and slipped away before they arrived. Told me to tell you to head for the alternate location if he wasn't back by the time you returned." The man glanced at the repair crew, then lowered his voice. "He saved my boy's life by sending you to get help. I wasn't about to turn him in." Relief and fear warred within Patience. Thomas had escaped immediate capture, taking Emma with him, but where had they gone? What alternate location was the man referring to? Then understanding dawned. During their journey, Thomas had pointed out several landmarks that could serve as rendezvous points if they ever became separated. The nearest was a distinctive rock formation about 5 miles north of their current position, easily recognizable but off the main trails, providing good visibility of the surrounding area. "How far behind were the soldiers?" she asked urgently. "They came and went," the man replied. "Searched the area, asked questions. I told them I'd seen a lone man heading south yesterday morning before my wagon broke down. They rode off in that direction." Patience nodded gratefully. "Thank you for not betraying him." The man shrugged. "Don't know what he's wanted for, don't care to know. But a man who'd risk himself for a stranger's child can't be all bad in my book." While the repair crew set to work on the broken wagon, Patience made her excuses, claiming she needed to search for her husband who had likely gone hunting. She rode north as soon as she was out of sight, pushing her horse as fast as she dared across the open prairie. The rock formation came into view after an hour's hard riding, a distinctive outcropping that resembled a sleeping buffalo when viewed from the east. Patience approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of Thomas or Emma. For several heart-stopping minutes she saw nothing. Then movement caught her eye, a figure emerging from the shadow of the rocks, a small bundle held securely in one arm, a rifle in the other hand. "Thomas." She called, relief flooding through her as she recognized him. He lowered the rifle, his posture relaxing as she rode toward him. Emma, strapped to his chest in the sling he had fashioned, began waving her arms excitedly at the sight of her mother. Patience dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, rushing to them with tears streaming down her face. She took Emma into her arms, covering her daughter's face with kisses while Thomas stood watching, his expression a mixture of relief and tension. "Are you all right?" he asked, scanning her for any sign of injury. "Did anyone follow you?" "We're fine," Patience assured him, looking up from Emma's smiling face. "The boy is being treated by the fort's doctor. His mother stayed with him, but they're sending a repair wagon to help fix the family's axle." She touched Thomas's arm. "What happened?" "The father said soldiers came looking for you." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Army patrol. They had a description man matching my build, traveling with a woman and infant." He glanced down at Emma, who was contentedly playing with a button on Patience's dress. "I heard them coming and slipped away before they arrived. Didn't want to risk them recognizing me, especially with Emma." "You did the right thing," Patience said firmly. "But what now? They'll be watching the trails east." Thomas nodded grimly. "We need to change our plans. Head north for a while, then east through less traveled territory. It will add weeks to our journey." The implications hung between them weeks more of travel, increased hardship, greater risk, and looming beyond that, the decision they had yet to finalize, continued ascent. Louis, as originally planned, or forge a new path together, Patience took a deep breath, suddenly certain of what she wanted. Thomas, I've been thinking about what I said before about Emma and me going with you instead of to St. Louis. His expression grew guarded. Patience, after what just happened, you must see how dangerous. I see a man who risked his own safety to help a stranger's child, she interrupted. A man who protected my daughter when danger threatened, a man I've come to. She paused, then committed fully, a man I've come to love. Thomas stared at her, surprise and longing warring in his eyes. You don't know what you're saying, he said hoarsely. The life I lead, always moving, always watching for danger, it's no life for a woman and child. It's better than a life without you, Patience replied simply. These past weeks have shown me what's possible between us. We're good together, Thomas, we make each other stronger, and Emma adores you. As if to emphasize her mother's point, Emma reached out from Patience's arms toward Thomas, her small face alight with recognition and affection. Almost unconsciously, Thomas reached back, allowing the baby to grasp his finger in her tiny hand. I can't offer you security, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Can't promise you comfort or stability. I'm not asking for those things, Patience said. I'm asking for partnership. For the chance to build something together, whatever that might be. Thomas looked at her with wonder, as if seeing her truly for the first time. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, he said softly, braver than you have any right to be. Is that a yes? Patience asked, hope rising within her. Instead of answering directly, Thomas closed the distance between them, cupping her face gently in his calloused hand. If I'm dreaming, he murmured, I don't want to wake. Then he kissed her, a kiss that spoke of longing held in check for too long, of hope rising from the ashes of despair, of a future neither had dared to imagine becoming suddenly, wonderfully possible. Emma, caught between them, made a sound of delighted surprise, breaking the moment and causing them both to laugh. Thomas stepped back, his eyes never leaving Patience's face. Yes, he said simply. If you're certain this is what you want, then yes. It is, Patience assured him, her heart fuller than she had thought possible. Where do we go from here? Thomas considered for a moment. Canada, I think, the Northwest Territories, far enough from my past that we might start fresh. He looked thoughtful. I still know horses. Could find work at a ranch, maybe eventually start our own place. A home, Patience said, savoring the word, for all of us. It won't be easy, Thomas warned. The journey north will be hard, especially with winter coming. We'll manage, Patience said confidently. We've come this far together. Thomas nodded, decision made. We should move soon. Those soldiers might circle back this way when they realize they've been misled. As they prepared to depart, gathering their belongings and checking the horses, Thomas paused, watching Patience secure Emma in her traveling sling. His expression softened with an emotion Patience had glimpsed before but now recognized clearly. Love. I never thought I'd have this again, he said quietly. A family, someone to care for, someone who cares for me. Patience smiled, her heart full. You've got a place in my life now, she said, echoing his words from their first meeting. Both our lives, and we have a place in yours. Thomas nodded, momentarily too moved to speak. Then he straightened, the capable protector once more, though the tenderness remained in his eyes. Let's ride, he said. We've got a long journey ahead. But as they set off toward the northern horizon, Patience felt no apprehension, only anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, but they would face it together, three souls united by circumstance and choice, finding in each other the home they had each been seeking. The journey north proved as challenging as Thomas had predicted. They traveled through increasingly rugged terrain, avoiding settlements and keeping to less traveled paths that tested both their endurance and Thomas's considerable wilderness skills. The weather turned colder as autumn deepened, forcing them to stop more frequently to ensure Emma stayed warm and well. Yet despite the hardships, these weeks were filled with a growing sense of family and purpose. Each evening around their campfire, they spoke of the future they hoped to build a small homestead perhaps, with good grazing land for horses and rich soil for Patience's garden. A place where Emma could grow up free from the shadows of the past, where Thomas might finally find the peace that had eluded him since losing his first family. They crossed into Canada as the first snows began to fall, making their way to a small settlement in the Saskatchewan Territory where Thomas had once briefly worked before heading south. The town of Riverspend was little more than a trading post with a handful of permanent structures, but it offered something precious: anonymity. Here, far from the reach of American law, Thomas Blackwood could become simply Thomas Miller, a widower who had remarried and was seeking a fresh start with his new family. The story required no elaborate explanations in frontier communities. Personal histories were rarely probed deeply, and the practical skills a man brought were valued far more than his background. Thomas's expertise with horses quickly earned him a position at the local livery stable, while Patience found occasional work sewing for the handful of families who called Riverspend home. They rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a crude structure by Eastern standards, but to Patience, who had spent months on the trail, it seemed a palace. With Thomas's help, she made it increasingly comfortable, sewing curtains from remnant fabric, fashioning furniture from local pine, creating a home from the barest of essentials. As winter settled fully over the land, bringing with it the deep cold of the Northern Territories, they found unexpected contentment in their snug cabin. In the evenings, Thomas would carve toys for Emma while Patience read aloud from the few books they had managed to acquire. The baby thrived despite the harsh conditions, growing stronger and more adventurous with each passing day, her first tentative steps taken across the plank floor of their modest home. Spring arrived late but gloriously, the land awakening from its long winter sleep with explosive growth and renewal. Thomas, who had proven himself indispensable at the livery stable, was offered the opportunity to purchase a small parcel of land several miles from town, 20 acres, with a natural spring and good pasturage, ideal for the horse breeding operation he hoped to establish. The price was within their means, thanks to careful saving and Thomas's growing reputation as the finest horseman in the territory. By midsummer, they had moved to their own land, living initially in a tent while Thomas, with help from neighbors, constructed a sturdy log cabin that would serve as their first real home together. On the day the cabin was completed, Thomas carried Patience across the threshold, Emma toddling behind them with delighted squeals. Inside, he set Patience gently on her feet and looked around at their handiwork: the stone fireplace, the polished wood floor, the windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. "It's not the grandest place," he said, a hint of apology in his voice. "Not what you might have had if Patience silenced him with a kiss. It's perfect," she said firmly, "because it's ours." That night, after Emma had been tucked into her small bed in the corner, Thomas and Patience sat together on the porch of their new home, watching as stars appeared in the vast northern sky. Thomas's arm encircled Patience's shoulders, drawing her close against the evening chill. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, the question revealing a vulnerability he rarely showed. Patience leaned into his embrace, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the chance encounter in Redemption Springs, the long trek eastward that had become a journey north, the gradual building of trust and love between two wounded souls finding healing in each other. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from the starlit sky to the dark outline of the small corral where his first two breeding mares now grazed. Then he looked back at Patience, his eyes reflecting the deep contentment that had slowly replaced the haunted wariness she had first seen in him. "I thought that part of my life was over," he said. "The part where a man puts down roots, builds something lasting, wakes up each morning with purpose." He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her palm. "You gave that back to me, you and Emma. You made me want to live again, not just survive." Patience felt tears welling in her eyes at the simple sincerity of his words. "We found each other when we needed each other most," she said. "That's no small thing." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's everything." As they sat together in companionable silence, Patience reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led them here, how a moment of intervention on a dusty street in Wyoming had changed the course of 3 lives forever. Had Thomas not stepped forward that day, had he not uttered those fateful words as he took Emma in his arms, their paths would never have converged, their hearts never found each other. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Patience smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was thinking about the day we met, about how sometimes the most important moments in our lives don't announce themselves as such until later." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Like when a gunslinger stops to help a widow and her baby, not knowing he's really saving himself." "Exactly like that," Patience agreed, her heart full of gratitude for the man beside her, this complex, honorable man who had become her partner, her protector, her love. Inside the cabin, Emma made a small sound in her sleep, drawing their attention. Thomas rose and offered Patience his hand, helping her to her feet. "We should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a busy day." As they went inside, closing the door on the vast wilderness beyond, Patience felt a profound sense of rightness. This was home, not just the physical structure, but the family they had formed, the bonds they had forged through hardship and hope. In the years that followed, their small homestead prospered. Thomas's reputation as a horse breeder grew throughout the territory, attracting buyers from as far away as Winnipeg and even occasionally from across the border. The original cabin was expanded as their family grew, first with the birth of a son they named Daniel, after Thomas's lost brother, and later a daughter they called Sarah, honoring the wife Thomas had loved and lost. Emma thrived in their northern home, growing into a capable young woman with her mother's determination and her adoptive father's quiet strength. Though she knew the truth of her parentage, Patience, and Thomas had always been honest with her about Jacob, she considered Thomas her true father in every way that mattered. And for Thomas and Patience, the love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances deepened with each passing year, strengthened by shared challenges and triumphs, by the family they had built together, by the knowledge that each had saved the other in ways beyond measure. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the children were asleep and the northern twilight lingered long into the night, they would sit together on their porch and remember the journey that had brought them together, the desperate widow, the solitary gunslinger, and the infant who had bridged the gap between them. "You've got a place in my life now," Thomas would sometimes say, echoing those words from long ago, his eyes filled with the same tenderness Patience had glimpsed that first day, but now freely expressed, no longer shadowed by grief or fear. And Patience would smile, knowing that those words, spoken first to a fatherless child but ultimately embracing them, all had become the foundation of everything they had built together. A place for each of them, secure and cherished in the lives they now shared. A home in every sense that truly mattered.